the trials. And apparently some of the explanation for, I think it's a secondary explanation, but some of the explanation for some of that lack of focus on the Holocaust during the Nuremberg tribunals was that the evidence was still coming out. So there was some of it that just took some more time and after immediately following the end of the war. So this is also another reason why we get an incomplete history lesson. Sometimes it just takes some time to find the information.
Well, you guys, I find this interesting because, you guys all in junior high and grade school and high school all know about the Holocaust. And I was growing up, and my parents were foreigners, they were down, and relatives murdered. We've never spoken about it. We heard about it in school. There was a few books that if you were a scholar you could find out about it. It wasn't unknown. But a lot of this data just came out. A lot of it came out. The Russians moved it slowly, but then the ones that liberated were camps. A lot of it came out of the Israeli trials. So we forget there's a part of the history of this jurisprudence of human rights and genocide is the slow emergence of this knowledge. So it's not like people say, of course they knew,
right? But
knowing in a kind of general way and knowing all the details that we know now were two very different. And for 10 years, no one knew. And consequently, no one knew very much. So that's an important point that you made. Well, everyone knew about the aggression in Poland.
Right.
And everyone knew about the aggression in Austria. And there's public documents that describe it. So we talk. The answer is we shouldn't abandon the court. And you're saying basically, in your view, we'll get to your own research in a moment, but about issues about norms, and it does establish.
I think it is.
When we talked about this, and we talked about the article, which I hope you guys read and will read, because it's a wonderful summary of all this. And Professor Muhammad was saying, well, look, there are other ways than criminal tribunals to deal with some of these issues that we hope criminal tribunals will deal with. So I put some of them on here. One is truth and reconciliation commissions. Can you just say a little bit about that as a genre of?
Yeah, so we're thinking about other ways of dealing with crimes following war or during war. And we've talked only at this point up until this point about criminal tribunals, and we have a lot of them, but there are also lots of other ways to answer the question of how to address these situations. So truth and reconciliation commissions have been one sort of favored approach over the last couple of decades. So what this means is instead of having an adversarial process in which we have one accused who has to assert his or her innocence, and we have prosecutors and judges who are evaluating that assertion of guilt or innocence, we have a non-adversarial process, sometimes even a non-legal process, depending on how they're set up. And instead of accusing a person of doing something, we have a situation instead where perpetrators are invited to share their accounts of what happened. Victims are invited to share their accounts of what happened. And the purposes of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are largely the same as the purposes of an international criminal tribunal. So to establish some truth about what happened, to find some path towards reconciliation, to show that the state has been cleansed, that society can move on, to give victims an opportunity to actually feel that their suffering has been acknowledged. So that's a purpose of international criminal tribunals, too, that we can add. And so we've seen these in a few cases. So South Africa might be the most famous one. And then Chile, Argentina. There's been some talk over the last few years of having some sort of Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in the United States to talk about crimes that have been committed over the last 10 years, since September 11th. And these are, these are really promising ways to get at some of the same goals of international criminal tribunals. And international law has had sort of a tense relationship with them. So over the course of the last couple of decades, as we get more and more international criminal tribunals, there's been the development of some law that says that states are required to prosecute the core crimes. So prosecute and punish is sort of the name of the game. If a state can't do it themselves, then they should be able to pass that on to an international criminal tribunal, or they should be required to extradite individuals who are in their country to other countries that might have jurisdiction to try those people. And part of what makes truth commissions sometimes work is an offering of amnesty, right? So if a perpetrator of some war crimes is invited to come and tell their story of what they've done in front of a truth commission, they're certainly not going to do it unless they know that that story that they tell is not going to subject them to criminal prosecution later, right? Otherwise, they have no interest in doing this. And that offer of amnesty has been really tricky for international law because of this burgeoning obligation to prosecute or extradite. So how is a state supposed to use a Truth and Reconciliation Commission when it's also supposed to prosecute or extradite? So this is one of the places where the law is changing. And there's a general understanding that for the worst crimes, so for genocide, right, that amnesty is illegal in those cases. So a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for individuals who have committed genocide is not consistent with international law. But for other crimes, amnesties are still legally permissible.
They did, in some cases, try people, like some states tried, like in Argentina, they tried these genocide, right?
Yeah.
So they combined this.
They combine it, and there's there are different ways to make those choices. So sometimes we see choices where individuals who choose, in South Africa, individuals who chose not to participate in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission could have been subject to prosecution. So that's one way to choose that difference. In Argentina, I think the choice was to try those individuals responsible for the most serious crimes and then use a truth commission for others. Sometimes you'll see discussions about sequencing the two, so do truth commissions first and see where that gets us, and then we can do trials later if we need to.
Bunch of questions. Here and then here.
Do you feel like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in a sense impedes the effort that you said of the International Criminal Tribunals to establish that the international human rights community stands against this and is not in support of this and to bring awareness to it? But does this not in essence impede it because someone who commits crimes against humanity can just go and assist in these events and then be...
So the question is, do truth commissions impede the success of the international community in expressing these norms through international criminal tribunals? And I think it's a great question. So my take is that it doesn't, or it doesn't have to, because these Truth and Reconciliation Commissions can still be strong expressions of opposition to the crime, strong expressions about the seriousness of these crimes, strong expressions of support for the victims of these crimes. So they can still be opportunities to strengthen the norms, express the norms, show commitment to the norms. What they don't do, though, is express that punishment for violation of those norms will necessarily follow. So that is where the Truth and Reconciliation Commission might not successfully communicate the same norms. But I would say that international criminal tribunals aren't doing a great job of expressing the norm that a perpetrator of these violations is going to be punished either, because there are so few people of the hundreds of thousands who commit these crimes. So few of them are actually being hauled in front of a court and being put in jail. When they are actually being prosecuted and convicted, it's very hard, I think, to accept that a 20-year prison sentence is the right punishment for a massacre of civilians. What does 20 years in prison mean? So I think that Truth and Reconciliation Commissions they raise some problems with respect to expression of some norm around punishment, but I don't think that international criminal tribunals are doing a great job either.
I just wanted to clarify if all of the evidence garnered from these Truth and Reconciliation Commissions is like off limits and taboo, or if some testimonials can be used in other international courts to prosecute.
It's usually up to the government that's constructing the tribunal or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So they can be constructed in different ways, and the ones that give the most protection are going to be the ones that get the most participation too.
The name still says something too. The Chilean was called the Historical Clarification Commission. It says a lot. The important lawyers were involved with this. Right? But
Yeah, and so
listen.
they.
Oh. Sorry, it's okay. You can ask another question, but I thought I missed something.
I'm unclear on this. Are you saying that the countries that participated within their internal, like, in other words, the nation that had an internal genocide, can set up its own commission? Or does that have to be constructed by another nation?
No, it can set up its own
Couldn't they
commission.
use it as a construct to sort of create amnesty themselves then?
Yes. Yes, they can. They can, but that's why we have international tribunals too, and that's why we have universal jurisdiction, which is something we don't have up here. So government could set up some sort of Truth and Reconciliation Commission to let itself off the hook, but that's not necessarily going to change the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, right? So the International Criminal Court still has power to address those events if it wants to. Universal jurisdiction is a different process. So instead of international courts, universal jurisdiction refers to a power by national courts to try individuals who have no connection to that country for these most serious crimes. So if the government of Sudan wanted to set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for itself, then the president of Sudan still shouldn't be traveling around Europe, right? He still needs to stay home.
We should go to the next point, but we're going to talk about criminal justice as an issue of human rights when Jonathan Simon is one of Mohammed's colleagues comes in. What he'll be talking to you about is just ordinary criminal jurisdictions in the state of California is not politics free. It's not free of all these debates.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of politics you hear now. It all seems very mushy. And it may not be quite as mushy in domestic ordinary criminal jurisprudence, but it's not as if this existed until not.
No, I think many of these questions still come up if we're just talking about ordinary criminal courts and punishment in the state of California. I mean, what are we doing when we send someone to prison for 20 years or life? What is that accomplishing? Are we actually accomplishing deterrence through this? Are we getting other people not to do the same thing? Are we? Yeah, so lots of great questions.
This is part one, the international part of a criminal discussion. We're going to have a domestic part of it as we get into the domestic part of it, of course. So that's one of the things. So with international tribunals, we have criminal Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Talk about lustration, what happened in Eastern Germany, and then civil litigation.
Yeah, so lustration is a process of purging